Another tense exchange today over the fate of the Energy East pipeline project and its importance for oil-producing provinces like Alberta. Pipelines, job losses, and the overall state of Alberta's economy, no doubt being discussed right now as Rachel Notley meets with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Edmonton. Notley has already signaled that she'll push the PM for some financial support. So how can the federal government help out? Is it time for the province to lessen its dependence on oil? And should Alberta, and this will be controversial, I know, introduce a sales tax to raise some badly needed cash? Time to go on the money. Joining me from Calgary is Herb Emery. He's the program director at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. And Trevor Harrison is the director of the Parkland Institute, and he joins us via Skype from Lethbridge. Good to see you, gentlemen.
Hello.
Okay,
Hello.
Herb, I'm going to start with you. When the Premier says, I want support, Alberta needs support of the federal government, what kind of help do you think would be the smartest thing for her to look for or ask for right now?
The simplest thing is look at the precedent set by the federal government in 2008-2009, where they targeted $4 billion in bailout for the auto sector. Energy is a vital sector. Why don't we make a case that if bailing out Ontario and Quebec made sense, let's give something like $2 billion towards the energy sector to stem us through the rough times as well.
I haven't heard that one before. That's interesting. Trevor, what do you make of that idea? A bailout project, a bailout package?
Yeah, I guess the only thing would be one of the things that came out of the royalty review just recently was the fact that there's been a lot of pretty inefficient companies within the oil sector. And so you want to watch when you're bailing out. You're not bailing out companies that in some sense, if you think in a Darwinian way, actually maybe should go. And some of the bigger players are actually, in fact, some of the most efficient. So, yeah, anytime you start to bail out, I think there's some serious questions there about efficiencies. There are other things certainly that the federal government can do, and I think they will do. I think the idea of looking at the EI premiums, I think, is important. And as the Premier has talked about, certainly infrastructure help. I think that's a big one to get a lot of people back working on things that actually are really lagging behind in the province.
Okay, so Herb, if it's not a bailout, and let's...
Well, I just want to touch on that bailout comment.
Yeah.
There is no consideration of the inefficient, low-productivity auto manufacturers and their bailout. So what we really need to think about is what levers does the federal government really have to help Albertans through the slump? And then there's the long-run forces to think about.
But are you saying, Herb, that the federal government should just put a bunch of money, give a bunch of money to oil companies to tide them over?
They did the same thing with Ford and General Motors, and no one blinked at that point. So why wouldn't it make sense to bail out the big guys in Alberta?
And would they get shares in exchange?
They could ask for that, and then we have public entrepreneurship. Like, again, you have to think through that the federal government in the past has picked other regions for bailout. Alberta's suffering, and now we're talking about insurance systems, efficiency gains. And so one could ask, given that we can't get to Tidewater, the rest of Canada may have an obligation to give us similar treatment to Ontario in the last financial crisis.
Okay, Trevor?
Well, and again, I think, that's one of the key things in the auto bailouts. There were actually shares. So, I mean, I'm all for if the public sector or the government is able to actually have shares in that. That's a useful thing. I think one of the things to keep in mind here when we think about Alberta's problems right now, and to some extent they mirrored in the rest of Canada, these are short, they're medium, and they're long-term things. Even if we get those pipelines, and there's obviously controversy around those, the fact is right now around the price of oil, it's just not an economical thing. So what is Alberta going to look like in future? What if the price of oil stays at $28, $29, $30 a barrel? What are we actually going to do? And I think those are the bigger long-term questions that we really have to think about. And this is not a problem we're facing here that has arisen just in the last couple of years either. This is like a 30, 35-year duration of getting ready for what's happening.
Well, and Herb, I mean, what about that? Okay, so bailout or not, is this not a signal that Alberta needs to diversify its economy, as the government itself has recognized there?
Well, again, the diversification project has been going on in Alberta since 1905, and we have to recognize that the oil sands were the diversification project of the 1970s and 80s. And so what we did is we didn't diversify away from oil, we diversified away from the source of the oil that we live off of. So the challenge we've had is Lougheed's attempted different reforms in the 70s and 80s, and he skirted with some public entrepreneurship. And what we're really asking Albertans to think about is, how committed are they to making the investment to wean off of oil? And what are they willing to pay in the short run in order to achieve it?
Okay, Trevor?
And the problem in the past is Albertans have not been willing to deal with the transition.
Trevor?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, certainly this is something of long duration here. And Lougheed, in fact, in '71 ran on a platform of diversifying. And in fact, what we ended up doing was becoming locked even more into the petrochemical economy. But there's different ways to think of diversification. Of course, the provincial government just in the last while announced some supports for the petrochemical industries. So even if you're going to stay within the rubric of the petroleum industry, you can think about value added. One of the things, and this is where the politics comes in, because over time politicians in Alberta have really allowed us to go back to producing kind of raw resources and not really producing the value added here. And that, to some extent, when you start to think, you expand, you get value added, maybe then you can start to have the kind of spread effects that we would expect from that kind of economy.
Okay, let me put another, I have to tell you, Herb, that already on Twitter your idea is being slagged, but let me put another, let me put another controversial idea on the table, because it was put on the table by 19 academics and economists this week. They said, hey, how about a sales tax? And I know that the finance minister has said no, absolutely not. But what do you both make of that idea? Herb, let me start with you.
Well, I support a sales tax if it's part of revenue restructuring. So the idea would be we fund all core services out of stable taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, corporate taxes, and when the oil and gas royalty revenues come back, we have a rule that those are saved and invested like Norway, and we only live off the return, but the capital is preserved.
Okay, and you signed that. Did you sign that letter, Herb? Yeah, you did.
Absolutely, and that comment was in the letter.
Okay. What do you make of that idea, Trevor Harrison?
Well, and in fact, in fair disclosure here, I was also one of the signatures to it. So, but Herb and I have actually agreed to disagree on everything else, just so we have a good show here. No, we actually, I think the idea is a sound one. I mean, part of the problem is that, quite frankly, governments in the past have been able to buy Alberta voters with their own royalties without looking to the future. And that is part of the diversification problem. And also a sales tax, if we funded core programs out of that, as Herb says, put that money when it comes back, we hope it will, into a kind of heritage fund, we could go a long ways towards smoothing out the booms and busts and dealing with the severe problems that a lot of people are facing now in the province as a result of this downturn.
Okay, let me ask you one more question each, and it's about this contingency fund that Alberta is applying for, up to $250 million. Herb Emery, do you think that makes sense, that Alberta should try and tap into that money?
Trying to decide which way to go. I've already asked for $4 billion, and now you're asking me would I take $250. I don't think $250 is. I don't think the dollar amount's going to do much for the province other than symbolism from the federal government.
Yeah.
I think they can do more for the province if they get serious about helping with the right of way to get to Tidewater, and if they're not prepared to do that, how about subsidizing oil by rail? They've got to do something to help the province get its product to market.
Herb, you are our most controversial economist ever. Trevor, let me hear you on that, and then I'll let you guys go.
I don't think anyone particularly wants to go down rail. I think that's probably a bit of a non-starter. I do think if you look at all the various pipelines that have been talked about, the one that seems the most plausible if you're going to put money on it right now probably is Energy East. And that probably serves some political and national objectives as well, that it will be more saleable. In the long term, I think one of the things that the federal government can do, and this is something where the federal and provincial governments need to work together, is we need to think what kind of economy Canada as a whole is going to have in future, and can we move towards some other kind of energy, some kind of new economy, and that requires some kind of expenditures on post-secondary, creative, kind of innovative technologies.
Yeah.
And that's something that provinces and the federal government should be working a lot more closely on. Okay,
I'm going to leave it there. Herb Emery and Trevor Harrison, thank you both. Smart thoughts, provocative thoughts. I hope you'll both come back.
Thank you.
Will do.
Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate it, gentlemen. Still ahead.